People ask me how I stay fresh in this business. It's about knowing when to upgrade. He gestured vaguely toward the back of the room where Elena stood in the shadows. My wife, bless her heart, she's like the foundation of an old building. Sturdy, reliable, but let's be honest, nobody looks at the foundation. They look at the penthouse view. He squeezed Bella's waist, his hand possessive and vulgar. And gentlemen, the view is spectacular up here. The room went silent in that particular way that only happens when social norms have been catastrophically violated. A few sycophants chuckled nervously, but most of the investors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, suddenly fascinated by their plates. The humiliation was visceral. This wasn't just a bad joke, it was a public discarding, a declaration that Elena was obsolete, replaceable, worthless beyond her utility. Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she didn't tremble. She felt the baby kick, a sharp reminder of the future she had to protect. She looked at Marcus, really looked at him, and realized the charisma she once adored was just narcissism wrapped in a silk suit. The chandeliers at the Metro Grand Hotel didn't just sparkle, they glared with an aggressive opulence that matched the atmosphere of the Obsidian Gala perfectly. This wasn't merely another corporate event. It was a carefully orchestrated celebration of power, wealth, and the brutal success of Thorne Dynamics. Elena Vance stood near the edge of the ballroom, her position as peripheral as her role had become in the public narrative of her husband's empire. She clutched a glass of sparkling water, her 7-month pregnancy making champagne impossible and her swollen ankles protesting inside sensible heels. Her navy gown was elegant but understated, a conscious choice that reflected her personality, refined, intelligent, but never demanding attention. But Elena wasn't just Marcus Thorne's pregnant wife standing dutifully in the shadows. She was the invisible engine of Thorne Dynamics, the person who actually made everything work while Marcus posed for magazine covers. Elena was the one who balanced the complex ledgers, navigated the labyrinthian zoning laws, and secured the high-risk loans that allowed Marcus to play the fearless entrepreneur. She was a forensic accountant by training, someone who understood money as a language, a system with rules that could be manipulated by those who truly understood them. Tonight was supposed to be their night, a celebration of the Zenith Tower deal, a skyscraper that would redefine the city skyline. Then Marcus's voice boomed over the microphone, echoing off the marble walls. I want to talk about vision. You can't build the future if you're holding on to the past. The crowd applauded enthusiastically. Marcus looked every inch the titan of industry in his expensive tuxedo, jacket unbuttoned casually. But he wasn't looking at Elena. His gaze was fixed on the front table where Bella sat, a 22-year-old brand ambassador wearing a dress that cost more than Elena's first car. Come up here, Bella, Marcus beckoned. Elena froze. The protocol was always the same. They went up together. They were partners, at least in public. This deviation was deliberate. The young woman floated up the stairs, giggling and clinging to Marcus's arm with unseemly familiarity. Marcus laughed, the sound loud and brittle, fueled by champagne and unchecked ego. Then he leaned into the microphone and said the words that would destroy him. People ask me how I stay fresh in this business. It's about knowing when to upgrade. He gestured vaguely toward the back where Elena stood. My wife, bless her heart, she's like the foundation of an old building. Sturdy, reliable, but let's be honest, nobody looks at the foundation. They look at the penthouse view. He squeezed Bella's waist, and gentlemen, the view is spectacular up here. The room went silent. A few sycophants chuckled nervously, but most investors shifted uncomfortably, suddenly fascinated by their plates. The humiliation was visceral. This wasn't just a bad joke, it was a public discarding, a declaration that Elena was obsolete, replaceable, worthless beyond her utility. Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she didn't tremble. She felt the baby kick, a sharp reminder of the future she had to protect. She looked at Marcus, really looked at him, and realized the charisma she once adored was just narcissism wrapped in a silk suit. A waiter whispered, "Should I get you a chair?" "No," Elena said, her voice terrifyingly calm. "I won't be staying." She didn't storm out or throw her drink. She simply turned and walked toward the exit with slow, rhythmic steps, her dignity intact even as her marriage shattered. As Elena pushed through the heavy double doors of the Metro Grand Hotel, the cold night air hit her face like a slap of reality. Behind her, she could still hear Marcus's voice, amplified over the speakers, blissfully unaware that he had just insulted the only person who knew the passwords to his life. The valet looked at her with concern, probably noticing the tight set of her jaw, the way her hands trembled slightly as she pulled out her phone. It was 9 o'clock on a Friday night, and while most people would go home to cry or scream or drink wine they couldn't have because of pregnancy, Elena Vance was built differently. "Siri," she said into the phone, her voice steady despite the chaos inside her chest. "Call the firm of Sterling and Moore." The line connected after 2 rings. A junior associate answered, surprised to hear from a client at this hour. "This is Elena Vance. I need you to ready the dissolution protocols immediately. Full corporate analysis, asset separation, and I want it on my desk by Monday morning." The associate stammered something about weekend rates and partner approval. "Bill me whatever it takes," Elena said coldly. "This is a priority 1 engagement." She hung up before they could ask questions. The drive home was silent except for the hum of the engine. Elena's mind was already working through the architecture of their empire, seeing it not as a monument to their partnership, but as a structure she had built brick by brick while Marcus took credit. She knew every vulnerability, every hidden clause, every legal loophole, because she had created most of them to protect him from his own recklessness. Now, those same protections would become weapons. When she arrived at their penthouse, the space felt different, colder, emptier, like a museum of a life that no longer existed. She didn't turn on all the lights. She went straight to her home office, the room Marcus never entered because numbers bored him, and booted up her computer. The blue glow illuminated her face as she began pulling files. Corporate documents, tax returns, property deeds, loan agreements, partnership structures. Everything she needed to understand exactly what she owned versus what Marcus merely controlled. At midnight, she found it. The document that would change everything. 3 years ago, when Marcus was being sued for a construction failure in Dubai, Elena had created a holding company called Vance Holdings to protect their assets. She had transferred intellectual property, architectural blueprints, and crucially, the land deeds for multiple properties into this entity. She had told Marcus it was for liability protection, a shield against lawsuits. He had signed the papers without reading them, too busy choosing leather for his private jet. Elena sat back in her chair, her hand resting on her pregnant belly. The baby kicked again, as if approving of what she was discovering. Marcus had humiliated her publicly, treated her like she was disposable, like she was just scenery in his grand performance. But he had forgotten the most important rule of construction. You can't build an empire on land you don't own. And Elena owned everything that mattered. She didn't cry, she didn't rage, she simply began to plan. And the empire didn't fall that night, but the first cracks had definitely been struck. Saturday morning usually meant brunch at the country club, mimosas and networking, the performance of being a power couple. But Marcus hadn't come home. Elena checked the shared family cloud location out of habit, not heartbreak, and saw his phone pinging from the Ritz-Carlton downtown. She didn't check it twice. She had more important things to do than track a cheating husband. Instead, she drove to the Thorne Dynamics headquarters, a steel monolith that stood silent and empty on weekends, a monument to capitalism sleeping until Monday. She swiped her keycard at the entrance, the master administrative card that Marcus had never bothered to carry because details were for subordinates, for the little people who actually made things work. The security guard nodded at her. Everyone knew Mrs. Vance, the woman who remembered their children's names and brought cookies at Christmas. She took the elevator to the executive floor and walked past Marcus's glass-walled showpiece office to her own corner office, the place where actual work happened, where decisions were made with spreadsheets instead of charisma. Elena booted up her terminal and cracked her knuckles like a pianist preparing for a performance. She wasn't just a wife who happened to work at the company. She was a forensic accountant by trade, someone who had built her career finding money that people tried to hide, unraveling complex financial structures that were designed to deceive. She knew where the bodies were buried in Thorn Dynamics because she was the one who had dug the graves, the one who had saved Marcus from tax audits and regulatory investigations more times than he could count. "Let's see who really owns what," she whispered to the empty office. She pulled up the file for Project Zenith, the crown jewel of Marcus's empire, the skyscraper that was supposed to define his legacy. To the public, to the investors, to the fawning journalists, it was a Thorn Dynamics project, Marcus Thorn's vision made manifest. But legally, the structure was a labyrinth, a maze of holding companies and subsidiary entities that Elena had constructed for protection. She traced the ownership chain, following the digital paper trail through shell corporations and legal entities. Thorn Dynamics held the construction contracts and the marketing rights. They had the architectural firm on retainer and the construction crews ready to break ground. But the land itself, the actual dirt that the billion-dollar tower would stand on, was owned by Vance Holdings, Elena's company, registered in her name alone. Marcus was merely a tenant, operating on a lease that renewed monthly, a lease that required the signature of the Vance Holdings director to continue. Elena had set up this structure years ago, and Marcus had signed off on it without reading the fine print, trusting her completely because she handled the boring stuff. Now, that trust was about to cost him everything. She opened a new document and began drafting a notice of non-renewal, her fingers flying across the keyboard with cold precision, each word a calculated strike against the man who called her a foundation nobody looked at. With the land issue secured, Elena moved deeper into the financial architecture of Thorn Dynamics, peeling back layers of corporate structure like an archaeologist excavating a temple built on sand. She opened the corporate credit accounts, the American Express black cards and platinum banking instruments that Marcus wielded like symbols of his success. The recent charges told a story of excess and stupidity. $15,000 for the gala tables where he had humiliated her, $4,000 at a nightclub at 2 in the morning, and an $8,500 purchase at a jewelry store that very morning, probably a guilt offering for Bella, or an apology gift he'd never have the courage to give Elena. She didn't cancel the cards. That would be too obvious, too emotional, the act of a scorned wife rather than a strategic opponent. Instead, Elena accessed something far more sophisticated, the debt covenants with their primary lender, Morrison Federal Bank. These were the legal agreements that governed their massive construction loans, the fine print that most CEOs never read because they had people like Elena to read it for them. Buried in Section 7, subsection D, was a clause Elena had personally inserted 2 years ago during a refinancing negotiation. It was called the reputational risk rider. The language was precise and devastating. If the chief executive officer engages in public behavior that demonstrably jeopardizes stock value or company reputation, the chief financial officer reserves the unilateral right to freeze capital expenditures to preserve liquidity and protect shareholder interests. At the time, the bank's lawyers had barely glanced at it. Marcus certainly hadn't. It seemed like standard protective language, the kind of bureaucratic safety net that would never actually be triggered. But Elena had known, even then, that Marcus's ego would eventually write checks his character couldn't cash. She pulled up the stock monitoring data. Thorn Dynamics was privately held, but they tracked valuation metrics for investor reports. In the 18 hours since the gala, 3 major investors had sent emails requesting urgent clarification calls. The whispers had already started. Marcus Thorn publicly humiliating his pregnant wife while flaunting a woman young enough to be his daughter wasn't just bad optics, it was a red flag about judgment, stability, and leadership. Elena took screenshots of the emails, documenting the reputational damage with the thoroughness of someone building a legal case. Then she executed the freeze. With 3 clicks and her CFO authorization code, she locked down the capital expenditure accounts. The millions of dollars that Marcus needed to pay the Zenith Tower contractors on Monday morning were suddenly trapped in an escrow account, frozen solid and inaccessible without her signature. The construction crews wouldn't get paid, the permits would lapse,
The entire project would grind to a halt, and Marcus would be standing in front of investors and contractors with empty promises and no way to deliver. Elena sat back in her chair, the blue light of the screen reflecting in her eyes. She wasn't stealing. She was curating, preserving, protecting. She was ensuring that when the inevitable crash happened, when Marcus's house of cards collapsed under the weight of his own arrogance, she and her unborn child would be standing on the only solid ground left. She printed the documents methodically, placing them in a leather binder that she labeled simply Monday. The word looked innocuous, almost mundane, but it represented a reckoning that Marcus couldn't even imagine was coming.
Elena spent the rest of Saturday afternoon building her fortress, document by document, clause by clause. She reviewed every contract that bore Marcus's signature, every partnership agreement, every investor memorandum. What she found was both predictable and damning. Marcus had been sloppy, overconfident, signing things without reading them because he trusted Elena to handle the details. That trust had been his biggest mistake. In business, as in marriage, trust without verification was just another word for vulnerability. She drafted a series of emails, each one carefully timed and strategically targeted. The first went to Harold Chen, their lead attorney at Morris & Federal Bank, marked for Monday delivery at 8 in the morning. It outlined the reputational risk trigger, attached evidence of Marcus's behavior and the investor concerns, and formally requested a credit review meeting. The second email went to the board of directors, all 7 members, requesting an emergency session on Thursday to discuss leadership concerns and fiduciary responsibility. She didn't mention Marcus by name. She didn't have to. The implications were clear enough. The third communication was the most surgical. Elena accessed the contractor payment system and left a note in the authorization queue. Payment pending CFO review due to budget reconciliation. Expected clearance Thursday afternoon post-board meeting. It was vague enough to buy time, specific enough to seem routine. The construction foreman would call Marcus on Monday morning, furious and confused, and Marcus would try to override the system, only to discover that he didn't actually have override authority. Elena had structured the financial controls years ago to require dual authorization for payments over $50,000, a safeguard against fraud that now served a very different purpose. She looked at the calendar. Monday, Marcus would discover the frozen funds. Tuesday, he'd try to fix it and fail. Wednesday, panic would set in as contractors threatened to walk and investors demanded explanations. Thursday, the board would convene and Elena would present them with a choice: remove Marcus or watch the company collapse. It was a timeline of destruction, a controlled demolition of a man who thought he was untouchable. As the sun set over the city, painting the office in orange and amber light, Elena allowed herself a moment of reflection. She thought about the years she'd spent building this company, the late nights balancing books while Marcus was at dinner parties, the times she'd saved them from financial ruin while he took credit for the recovery. She thought about the gala, about standing there pregnant and humiliated while he squeezed another woman's waist and called Elena obsolete. The anger she felt wasn't hot, it was cold, crystalline, pure. It was the anger of someone who had finally stopped making excuses for someone else's cruelty. She shut down her computer, gathered her documents, and locked the office behind her. On the drive home, she stopped at a baby store and bought a mobile for the nursery, soft clouds and stars that would hang above the crib. She assembled it that evening in the quiet room painted soft gray, a room that Marcus had never bothered to help decorate because he was too busy changing the world. As she hung the last star, her phone buzzed. It was Marcus, finally. A text message. Stayed at the hotel, needed space to think. See you tomorrow. Elena read it twice, then deleted it without responding. He wanted space? She'd give him all the space in the world, the vast, empty space of losing everything he thought he owned.
By Tuesday, the silence in the house was deafening, thick with unspoken accusations and the weight of a marriage that had finally cracked beyond repair. Marcus had returned home Monday night,
smelling of expensive cologne layered over stale guilt, the scent of a man who'd spent the weekend pretending consequences didn't exist. He tried to play it off as business as usual, pouring coffee with studied casualness, avoiding Elena's eyes as he constructed his alibi. "You know how these investors are," he said, his voice too loud in the quiet kitchen. "Gotta wine and dine 'em, keep 'em happy. Sorry about the joke at the gala, just working the crowd, you know how it is." Elena stood at the counter, methodically buttering a piece of toast, her movements precise and unhurried. She didn't look up, didn't acknowledge his pathetic attempt at normalization. "It's fine, Marcus," she said, her voice flat and emotionless. "I've been busy too, working on the Zenith contracts, making sure everything is ready for the board meeting on Thursday." Her tone was so normal, so businesslike, that Marcus visibly relaxed, his shoulders dropping as relief flooded through him. He had expected screaming, tears, threats of divorce. Instead, he got efficiency and calm, which he mistook for forgiveness. Right, the big launch," Marcus said, pouring himself more coffee, already planning his triumphant presentation. "Everything good to go?" He was already thinking about the press conference, the interviews, the magazine covers that would cement his legacy as a visionary. "Everything is exactly where it needs to be," Elena replied, and there was something in her tone, a subtle edge that Marcus was too self-absorbed to catch. She took a bite of toast, chewed carefully, and finally looked at him. Their eyes met for just a moment, and in that brief connection, Marcus should have seen the storm coming. But he only saw his wife, his reliable foundation, the woman who always fixed his problems and asked for nothing in return. He smiled at her, that charismatic smile that had won her over a decade ago, and went back to his phone, scrolling through emails and missing every single warning sign. For the next 2 days, Elena played the ghost, present but absent, moving through the house like a shadow. When the construction foreman called Marcus on Tuesday morning, screaming that the checks hadn't cleared and his crew was threatening to walk off the job, Elena was ready. She intercepted the call on the office line, her voice smooth and reassuring, the voice of competence that everyone in the industry trusted. "It's just a banking glitch, Tom," Elena told the foreman, using his first name, reminding him of their relationship. "You know how these automated systems are. Keep working. I'll personally guarantee the funds by Thursday afternoon, right after our board meeting. You have my word." The foreman's anger dissolved immediately. "Your word is good enough for me, Mrs. Vance," he said, and Elena could hear the unspoken comparison. "Your word, not your husband's. We'll keep the crews going, but Thursday, right? I've got payroll Friday morning." Elena assured him it would be handled, and when she hung up, she allowed herself a small, grim smile. Everyone trusted Elena Vance. She remembered their kids' birthdays, their anniversaries, their struggles. She was the human face of Thorne Dynamics, while Marcus was just the logo. Meanwhile, Marcus was distracted, gloriously and predictably distracted. Bella was demanding to be featured in the Zenith marketing campaign, sending him dozens of messages with photo shoots and branding ideas. He spent hours in the design studio with her, ignoring the flashing red lights on his financial dashboard because Elena had quietly disabled his notifications, a small technical adjustment that Marcus never noticed because he barely understood the systems that ran his own company. Wednesday evening brought the phone call Elena had been waiting for. Her cell phone lit up with a name that made her heart rate quicken slightly. Arthur Henderson, chairman of the board of directors. Arthur was old money, a man who had built 3 fortunes and lost 2, someone who understood that empires rose and fell on the strength of their foundations, not the shine of their facades. Elena answered on the second ring, stepping into the nursery where she could speak privately, away from Marcus, who was downstairs on a video call with Bella, discussing color schemes like the world wasn't about to end. "Elena," Arthur's voice was grave, weighted with the authority of someone who had seen this story play out before. "I'm looking at the reports you sent over, the liquidity analysis, the reputational risk assessment, the contractor payment delays. Is this accurate?" There was no accusation in his tone, just a businessman seeking confirmation of data that would inform a significant decision. "It is, Arthur," Elena replied softly, her hand resting on the crib she had assembled alone.
Marcus is hemorrhaging capital on personal expenditures while the Zenith project sits in financial limbo. If we don't restructure the leadership by Thursday, Morrison Federal calls the loan on Friday. The company dissolves by the end of the month. She paused, letting the timeline sink in. And the land rights for Zenith, the actual property the tower sits on, that's held by a private entity. She didn't say the name yet. She wanted him to ask. What entity? Arthur's voice sharpened with the instinct of someone who had just sensed a major complication. Vance Holdings. Mine. The word hung in the air like a guillotine blade. I own the dirt, Arthur. Foreign Dynamics has a lease, but it's month to month, and it requires my signature to renew. I set it up 3 years ago as liability protection, and Marcus signed off on it without reading the structure. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that meant calculations were being made, political positions were being evaluated, and survival instincts were kicking in. Arthur Henderson hadn't stayed wealthy by being loyal to sinking ships. I see, he finally said. You hold all the aces, Elena. I never wanted to play cards, Arthur, Elena said, and for the first time her voice tightened with genuine emotion. But I won't let him gamble away my child's future. I won't let him destroy what I built just because he thinks loyalty is weakness and competence is boring. She took a breath, steadying herself. The board meets Thursday at 10. I'm presenting a restructuring proposal. You'll want to review it tonight. I'll have my attorney look at it within the hour. Elena, I've known Marcus for 15 years. Brilliant marketer, hell of a salesman. But you're the reason any of us invested in the first place. We knew he had the vision, but you had the execution. He paused. See you in the boardroom. And Elena, don't back down. Men like Marcus only respect power, and right now you have all of it. The call ended, and Elena stood in the soft light of the nursery looking at the mobile she had hung, the little stars turning slowly in the air current. Downstairs, she could hear Marcus laughing, that booming, confident laugh of a man who thought he was invincible. She turned off the nursery light and headed downstairs. She had emails to send and a final document to prepare, the termination notice for the land lease, effective Thursday at noon. The king was about to lose his castle, and he didn't even know the siege had already begun.
Wednesday night, after Marcus had finally gone to bed, still oblivious to the machinery of his destruction grinding into motion all around him, Elena sat alone in the nursery. This room had become her sanctuary over the past months, a space she had designed with care and intention, painted in soft gray with white trim, furnished with a crib she had assembled herself because Marcus was always too busy. She had chosen every detail, the cloud-shaped lamp, the bookshelf already filled with children's stories, the rocking chair positioned by the window where she could feed her son and watch the city lights. She placed her hand on her belly, feeling Leo kick and shift. 7 months along, and soon this abstract concept of motherhood would become concrete, real, a tiny human who would depend on her for everything. That dependency terrified and motivated her in equal measure. She thought about what kind of world she was bringing her son into, what kind of example she would set. Would she be the woman who stayed quiet while being humiliated? The woman who accepted cruelty because it was easier than fighting back? Or would she be the woman who taught her son that dignity had to be defended, that sometimes love meant knowing when to walk away, that strength wasn't always loud and aggressive. Sometimes it was quiet, strategic, and absolutely devastating. Elena thought about the years she had spent building Thorn Dynamics alongside Marcus, the late nights when she was pregnant with ambition instead of a child, balancing books until 3 in the morning while Marcus networked at parties. The time she had saved them from financial ruin, from tax audits, from regulatory investigations that would have destroyed them. She had been the firewall between Marcus's recklessness and total catastrophe, and he had rewarded her loyalty by calling her obsolete in front of 300 people. The memory of the gala still burned, not with the heat of fresh anger, but with the cold clarity of permanent understanding. She wasn't doing this out of spite, she realized. This wasn't revenge for the sake of revenge. This was a rescue mission, a surgical extraction of herself and her son from a burning building before it collapsed completely. Marcus had shown her exactly who he was, not in a moment of weakness, but in a moment of strength, when he felt powerful and untouchable. He meant every word. He genuinely believed she was just infrastructure, something to be used and then discarded when a newer model came along. And men who believed that didn't change. They just got better at hiding it until the next time they felt invincible. Elena stood up from the rocking chair and walked to the window. The city sprawled before her, millions of lights representing millions of lives, all of them built on foundations that nobody saw or appreciated. She thought about all the wives and partners who did the invisible work, who made the empires possible while their husbands collected the glory. She thought about how many of them stayed silent when they were dismissed, how many accepted humiliation as the price of security. Elena had been that woman once, but she wasn't anymore. The gala had been a liberation, a violent severing of the last threads of self-deception. Tomorrow was Thursday. Tomorrow the board would convene. Tomorrow Marcus would walk into that conference room expecting a coronation and instead find a tribunal. Elena felt no satisfaction in this, no vengeful joy. She felt only the grim necessity of someone doing what needed to be done. She touched the crib one more time, her fingers tracing the smooth wood. "I'm doing this for you," she whispered to her unborn son, "so you never think it's okay to treat people like they're disposable, so you understand that power without character is just tyranny wearing a nice suit." She turned off the light and closed the door softly, leaving the nursery behind and walking toward the future she was about to create, one devastating revelation at a time.
Thursday morning arrived with the sterile brightness of a surgical theater, appropriate for what was about to happen. The conference room on the 40th floor of Thorne Dynamics was all glass and steel, offering a panoramic view of the city, including, ironically, the gaping hole in the ground where the Zenith Tower was supposed to rise. The board of directors sat around the mahogany table in careful silence, 7 people who collectively controlled hundreds of millions in investment capital. Arthur Henderson sat at the far end, his face carved from granite, unreadable. Elena sat to his right, hands resting on a black leather folder, wearing a cream-colored suit that made her look not like a victim, but like a prosecutor. At 10:15, 15 minutes late because punctuality was for subordinates, Marcus burst through the door. He was manic with energy, practically vibrating with confidence, flanked by Bella, who wore sunglasses indoors and scrolled through her phone like she was attending a mildly boring photo shoot. Sorry, Marcus boomed, his voice filling the room with aggressive cheerfulness. Traffic was a nightmare. Bella, grab a seat. He gestured vaguely toward an empty chair. Everyone, you know Bella, our new creative visionary. She's going to revolutionize our branding. The board members didn't nod. They didn't smile. They stared with the collective disapproval of people who had seen this performance before and were no longer impressed. Marcus missed every signal, too intoxicated by his own narrative to read the room. Right, he clapped his hands together, the sound sharp and jarring. Big day. Let's get the bank release signed so we can pay the contractors and get shovels in the ground. I've got a press release ready for noon, interviews scheduled for this afternoon. He pulled out his tablet to initiate the fund transfer, expecting the routine approval that always came. He tapped the screen, frowned, tapped again. A red error box pulsed with digital hostility. Authorization denied. CFO override required. Marcus stared at it, his smile freezing into something brittle and confused. He tapped it a third time, as if the system was simply malfunctioning, as if reality would bend to his will if he just insisted hard enough. "The system is glitching again," he said, looking down the table at Elena, his tone still casual but with an edge of irritation creeping in. "Can you override this real quick? We're burning daylight here." "It's not a glitch, Marcus," Elena said, her voice smooth and carrying to every corner of the room, precise as a scalpel. "It's a liquidity freeze. I initiated it on Tuesday under Article 4, Section B of our corporate bylaws." She said it casually, like she was discussing the weather, and that casual tone made it worse somehow, more devastating than anger would have been. "You what?" Marcus laughed, a nervous bark that echoed in the silent room. "Stop playing around, Elena. Release the money. We've got contractors waiting, investors expecting updates." He looked around the table for support, for someone to tell him this was a joke, a misunderstanding that would be cleared up in moments. Nobody met his eyes. "I can't release it, Marcus," Elena said, and now there was something in her voice, a finality that cut through his denial. Under the bylaws that you signed, the CFO has the authority and obligation to freeze company assets if the CEO's personal spending endangers the company's solvency. She opened the black folder and slid a printed report down the long table. It stopped perfectly in front of him, the pages crisp and damning. You've spent $200,000 of company money in 3 days on jewelry, on hotels, on nightclubs, on her. Elena gestured slightly toward Bella, the motion economical and devastating.
Bella looked up from her phone, sunglasses sliding down her nose, her expression shifting from boredom to alarm as she realized she was suddenly part of a corporate investigation. "Wait, what?" she said, her voice higher than before. Marcus's face went through a rapid evolution of colors, red to white to a splotchy purple that suggested his blood pressure had just spiked into dangerous territory. "That's a lie," he shouted, standing up so quickly his chair rolled backward and hit the glass wall. "I am the majority shareholder. I built this company. I can spend what I want." "Actually," Arthur Henderson spoke up for the first time, his voice gravelly with age and authority, "you are the face of the company, Marcus, the public persona, the marketing arm, but you don't own the infrastructure." He looked at Elena, giving her the floor with a slight nod, and in that gesture Marcus could see the alliance that had formed against him, the careful positioning that had happened in phone calls and emails he had never seen. Elena opened her folder wider and removed a second document, this one thicker, bound with a blue cover that meant legal weight, official status. "The Zenith Tower is being built on land owned by Vance Holdings," she said, her voice steady and relentless. "My company, registered in my name, established 3 years ago during the Dubai litigation." She slid the document down the table, and Marcus grabbed it with shaking hands, his eyes scanning the pages frantically, looking for the loophole, the escape clause, the mistake that would save him. "We had a lease agreement," he whispered, his voice suddenly small, all the bombast drained out of him as the reality began to penetrate his defenses. "You can't just—" "The lease was month to month," Elena interrupted, and her voice was merciless now, stripped of all pretense of partnership or affection. "It required my signature for renewal. As of this morning, due to non-payment of lease fees and catastrophic reputational damage to my holdings through your public behavior, I have evicted Thorn Dynamics from the site." She let that sink in, watching his face as the full scope of his situation became clear. "Without that land, Marcus, Thorn Dynamics is selling air, promises, vaporware. The stock becomes worthless overnight. The investors will sue you personally for fraud because you sold them shares in a skyscraper that legally cannot be built." The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic 40 floors below. Marcus looked at the board members, really looked at them, searching for an ally, someone who would stand with him against this betrayal. But they were all looking at Elena, waiting for her next move, recognizing that she held all the leverage and that Marcus was just a man with a good story and empty pockets. "You can't evict me from my own building," Marcus said, but his voice cracked on the word own, and everyone heard it, the moment his confidence finally shattered. "It's not your building," Elena said, and these 4 words destroyed him more completely than any insult, any humiliation. "It's a hole in the ground on my dirt, and without my permission, you can't put a single brick on it." She paused, letting him absorb the totality of his defeat. "However, I do have a solution." She pulled out one final document, a resignation letter already prepared, already reviewed by attorneys, already approved by the board in a pre-meeting Marcus hadn't known was happening. Marcus stared at the resignation letter like it was written in a foreign language, his brain refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. "You want me to resign?" he said slowly, testing the words, seeing if saying them aloud would make them less real. "From the company I built? The company with my name on it?" His voice was rising again, grasping for the anger that had always served him, the righteous fury that usually bent people to his will. "The company we built," Elena corrected, and the pronoun hit him like a physical blow. "And yes,
You resign as CEO immediately. You surrender your voting rights but retain your non-voting shares. In exchange, I won't sue you personally for embezzlement, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. The board will install me as interim CEO, and I will grant Thorne Dynamics a new lease under restructured terms that actually protect shareholder value. And if I refuse? Marcus hissed, looking around the table one more time, desperate for someone to acknowledge the insanity of what was happening, the injustice of his wife dismantling him in front of his own board. Then I evict the company entirely, Elena said, her voice devoid of anger, which somehow made it worse. The Zenith project dies. The stock tanks. Morrison Federal calls the loan. You're left with 100% ownership of absolutely nothing. She leaned forward slightly. And I still sue you for the embezzlement, which means personal bankruptcy, Marcus. No golden parachute, no severance package, just debt and lawsuits and the kind of public scandal that makes you unemployable in this industry forever. Arthur Henderson slid a pen across the table. It rolled slowly, inexorably toward Marcus, coming to rest against his hand. "It's a generous offer, Marcus," the old man said, not unkindly. "Take it. Walk away with something instead of nothing." Marcus looked at his wife, really looked at her for perhaps the first time in years, seeing not the quiet woman who handled details, but the architect of his destruction, the person who had known exactly where to strike to bring down his entire world. "Why?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Over a joke? One bad night?" "It wasn't a joke, Marcus," Elena said, and now, finally, there was emotion in her voice, not anger, but something sadder, something that sounded like grief for what they could have been. "It was the truth, your truth. You revealed exactly what you thought of me, what you've probably thought for years. You thought I was weak because I was quiet. You thought I was disposable because I was loyal. You thought I was just infrastructure, something to be used and discarded when something shinier came along." She placed her hand on her belly. "You forgot that I didn't just marry the boss. I built the boss, and I can unbuild him just as easily." The scratching of the pen on paper sounded like a scream in the silent room. Marcus signed his name, the signature shaky and weak, nothing like the bold flourish he usually used on contracts and magazine covers. He slumped back in his chair, suddenly looking 10 years older, all the vitality drained out of him by the reality of consequences he had never imagined would apply to him. "Effective immediately," Arthur Henderson announced, collecting the papers with practiced efficiency, "Marcus Thorne is removed as CEO of Thorne Dynamics. Elena Vance assumes the role of interim CEO with full operational authority." He looked at Marcus without sympathy. "Security will escort you to your office to collect personal effects. You have 1 hour." Marcus turned to Bella in the corner, his last desperate grasp for an ally, someone who would validate him, tell him he was still powerful, still important. "Babe," he said, his voice pathetic, "let's go. I still have contacts, investors who believe in me. We'll figure this out." Bella stood up slowly, slinging her designer bag over her shoulder. She looked at Marcus, really looked at him, seeing not a powerful CEO, but a disgraced, broke man being investigated for fraud. Then she looked at Elena, the pregnant woman who had just dismantled a corporate empire without raising her voice. Bella let out a short, cold laugh. "You're broke, Marcus," she said flatly, "and you're toxic. My brand can't be associated with a loser." She walked toward the door, pausing just long enough to add, "Good luck with the lawsuits." The door closed behind her with a soft, final click.
6 months later, the city skyline had changed. The construction cranes were gone, replaced by the gleaming steel and glass of the newly christened Vance Spire, rising 70 stories into the sky like a monument to quiet competence and strategic patience. Elena sat in the corner office that Marcus used to occupy, though she had redecorated completely, removing the ostentatious leather furniture and expensive art that screamed insecurity, replacing it with functional elegance, warm woods, and a space that actually felt like work happened there instead of just ego maintenance. In the corner of the office, a high-end bassinet held 3-month-old Leo, sleeping soundly despite the hum of the city below. Alana had proved something that shocked the business press. You could run a multi-million-dollar construction company while being a single mother. In fact, she ran it better than Marcus ever had because she understood that leadership wasn't about charisma and magazine covers. It was about competence, follow-through, and treating people like they mattered. Her intercom buzzed. "Miss Vance," her assistant said, her voice professionally neutral. "I have a Marcus Thorne on line 2. He says it's urgent, something about needing a reference for a loan application." Elena looked out the window at the city she now commanded, the skyline she had helped build. She could see the Vance spire in the reflection of the glass, a testament to what happened when you underestimated the foundation. She thought about the gala, about standing in the shadows while Marcus called her obsolete. She thought about the humiliation, the betrayal, the moment she realized that dignity had to be defended, not just preserved. "Tell him to submit his request via email to the HR department," Alana said calmly, her voice carrying no anger, no triumph, just the professional distance of someone dealing with a former employee. "They handle inquiries from former staff." She clicked the line dead before her assistant could respond. There was no satisfaction in it, no vengeful joy. It was simply the natural consequence of his choices meeting the reality he had created. She picked up her pen to sign the quarterly dividend report. The company was profitable, the investors were happy, and the Vance Spire was already 60% leased before completion. She had proven that the foundation wasn't just important, it was everything. Without it, the whole structure collapsed, and Marcus had learned that lesson in the most expensive way possible. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Lunch this weekend? Want to see my grandson?" Elena smiled, the first genuine smile of the day, and typed back a yes. Leo stirred in his bassinet, making the small sounds that meant he'd wake soon, wanting to be fed and held. Alana stood up, walking over to pick up her son, cradling him against her chest. "You're going to grow up knowing something important," she whispered to him, his tiny hand grasping her finger with surprising strength. "You're going to know that people aren't disposable, that loyalty isn't weakness, that the people who do the invisible work are the ones who actually hold up the world." She kissed his forehead, breathing in that particular baby smell of innocence and possibility. Outside, the city continued its relentless rhythm, millions of transactions and relationships and empires rising and falling. But in this office, 40 floors above the chaos, Elena Vance had found something more valuable than revenge. She had reclaimed her narrative, rebuilt her life on her own terms, and created a future where her son would never mistake cruelty for strength or humiliation for humor. She had been the foundation once, invisible and underestimated. Now she was the architect, the builder, the CEO, and everyone could see her just fine.